G'day guys, 24mm on a crop sensor camera is basically 35mm on a full frame camera. Am I right? Okay guys, in this video we're comparing how the RF 24mm f1.8 on the R7 crop sensor body compares alongside the RF 35mm f1.8 on a full frame body. Now factoring in the 1.6 times crop, the 24mm on the crop sensor equates to about 38.4mm, so they're almost the same. But do you get the same performance using the 24mm on a crop sensor than you do using the 35mm on a full frame? Let's check it out. We've got 5 tests. We're going to crack into it. Okay, so the first test is I wanted to check out the low light performance of these two setups. So I shot out early in the morning, 5 AM, down to the Fonterra factory. Where else would you go to test low light shooting? But anyway, we went there and we tested it out. I set the exposures at 1/4 of a second at f4 on both cameras, and let's see how we went. So to start with, I started with the ISO at 800 just so I could get a little bit of light into the shot. And if we look at the first photo here, this is the full frame with the 35mm at ISO 800. And it's pretty good, it's pretty sharp. It's dark, but it is pretty sharp. I can't see huge amounts of noise at ISO 800. Comparing that alongside the R7 at ISO 800, and it looks very similar. The results are very similar. I then punched it up to ISO 1600. We doubled it. And let's see how we got on here. Punching in, I can see a little bit of noise creeping in, a little bit of grain, but not much besides. If we compare that with the R7, checking in here, again, to me, it seems pretty similar. Can't see too much difference there. So let's double it again. We went to ISO 3200. I left the shutter speed at 1/4 of a second and I left it at f4. Checking on the full frame with the 35mm. The image is definitely brighter now. I'm punching it, I'm starting to see quite a bit of grain, quite a bit of noise in the image, but still it's pretty good. It's not too bad. Checking on the R7 now, punching in. That's a little bit curious. It looks to be similar amounts of grain, maybe very slightly more than what we see with the 35mm on the full frame. So let's punch it right up. We're going to double it again. We're going to 6400. Zooming in, looking at the top of that there. And yeah, there's noticeable noise. It has really brightened up the image now, of course, as well. And on the R7, again, similar. Would you argue there's more on the R7 there? On the crop sensor with the 24mm? Not sure. So let's push it up. We're going to 12,800. Here it is. It's pretty good, actually. There's not a whole lot of noise. I'm pretty happy with that. At 12,800 ISO in low light. And now looking at the R7, punching in. Yeah, and at this point I can see there's quite a bit more noise, quite a bit more grain. So I think in this case, the 35mm on the EOS R or the full frame camera is the winner. Okay, the next test I wanted to do was depth of field to see whether or not the 35mm on the full frame had better fall off in terms of the background blur than what you might achieve with the 24mm on the crop sensor. Now I did try to keep the angle as close to being the same as possible. I was using 2 tripods. I guess I could have used 1 tripod, but I had 2 tripods and I had them very close together, trying to get a similar field of view and trying to get a similar angle so we could get some results we could rely on in a way. So we started off with the 35mm on the full frame and we were at f1.8 in this image here. We focused on the T, and as you can see in this image, the T and the H are well in focus and then it starts to fall away, but it's nice and soft the way it falls away. It's quite pleasing. You can see also the brickwork falls away into background blur as well. Comparing that with the R7, we focused on the T again. This was at f1.8 with the 24mm. And you can see more of the letters are in focus. The T, the H, the E, the S. It doesn't seem to fall away quite as gracefully as it does on the full frame. Okay, so I stopped the aperture down to f4 and let's check it out on the full frame. This is the 35mm. And yeah, it's still falling away pretty gracefully, pretty nicely. And we'll compare that with the 24mm on the crop sensor. And wow, at f4, almost everything seems to be in focus already. So it's definitely not falling away as smoothly or as evenly, or even really at all. I mean, it is, but it's very subdued, the fall off, the background blur in terms of the depth of field with the 24mm on the crop sensor at f4. So I stopped it down to f8 and let's have a look here with the 35mm on the full frame. And again, we are falling away into background blur. It's quite nice. It's pleasing actually. Let's have a look at that against the R7 at f8. Well, pretty much everything's in focus here On the f8 all the way down the wall, you could read the letters clear as day. There doesn't seem to be anywhere near as much fall off into background blur. The depth of field is very, very broad with the 24mm on the crop sensor at f8. And just for fun, we did stop it down to f22 with the 35mm on the full frame. Yes, as expected, pretty much everything's in focus, but there's a tiny bit of background blur or fall off right at the very right edge of the frame. Comparing that to the R7 with the 24mm, and everything is in focus. Everything's in focus. So in terms of the depth of field, well, the 24mm on the crop sensor has a greater depth of field, but in terms of falling off into that background blur or looking to achieve bokeh, then it's clearly the 35mm on the full frame is the winner in this case. Okay, the next test I wanted to do, and we kind of already know the answer to this, is the field of view test. Now for this test, I had the camera set up side by side, looking downrange from exactly the same point, exactly the same height, and we're trying to see which of the two options is going to give you the wider field of view. And so as we know, we've got the 35mm on the full frame camera and we've got the 24mm on the crop sensor. We know that by having the 24mm on the crop sensor, it gives us an effective field of view of 38.4mm. So I think you already know which one's going to give us the wider field of view, but let's check it out anyway. So here we are with the 35mm on the full frame, and it's quite a wide view. We can see the tree on the right hand side of the frame is fully within the frame, and there's quite a chunk left to the outside of that. And then we've got a big chunk of bush on the left hand side of the frame, and you can see at the bottom where the ground comes back, we've got those hedge edgings well in frame, and we've got a good chunk of sky above the shot. Switching now to the 24mm on the crop sensor, well, there's not quite as much room out to the right of the tree. There's not quite as big of a chunk of bush on the left hand side of the frame. We don't have quite as much sky, and we don't see quite as much of those hedge edgings down below. So as we had already determined, the wider field of view still comes with the 35mm on the full frame camera. It's slightly tighter with the 24mm on the crop sensor camera. The next one I tried was a portrait, just a standard portrait, and unfortunately you're going to have to look at this mug here for this test. And we started off here with the full frame camera with the 35mm, and the camera was actually positioned about this far away from me. Do we see that? Not so far, maybe 50 centimeters, a foot and a half, something like that. And here we have the 35mm on the full frame camera, and it's an okay portrait. It looks natural-ish, considering the subject matter we're dealing with here. And if we flick to the same portrait with the same position of the camera, this time the 24mm on the crop sensor, okay, so yeah, as we know, it's got a tighter field of view. And I was actually expecting in this case that the 24mm on the crop sensor would maybe have a bit more of a natural feel or a bit more of a natural appearance to the face. I've got a different pose on in both of these photos, but to me they're quite similar. I just feel that the 35mm on the full frame gives a more natural field of view in that one. Okay, and the next test we're going to look at is the macro performance of these two lenses. So that's the 35mm on the full frame and the 24mm on the crop sensor camera. So starting off here with the 35mm on the full frame, you can see you can get reasonably close to this particular lapel pin, but check out this, with the 24mm on the crop sensor, you can get a heck of a lot closer, and not only that, it's really, really sharp as well. And just to show that is also true, here is another macro image. This here is with the 35mm on the full frame camera of my Apple Watch. This is a first generation Apple Watch, by the way, and you can get pretty close, but the close focusing distance of the 24mm on the crop sensor camera allows you to get way, way in closer, a lot closer at its minimum focusing distance. So in this case, the crop sensor wins. And for this final test, I've just got 30 seconds of video from each of these two cameras for you to look at, and if you can detect a difference in the performance of either of these two cameras, then it's probably going to be a miracle. But here you go. In fact, we'll make it 15 seconds. We don't need to be here 30 seconds for each. We're going to start off with the 35mm on the full frame camera, and this is video straight out of camera. And both of these clips are filmed in full HD. Could have gone to 4K, but of course with the full frame camera that I have, it does have a crop applied to it as well. So I dialed back the R7 down to full HD as well. And we'll switch to that video now. They both look nice. This one looks nice as well. Yeah, they look pretty good. They look pretty good. Let's pop them up side by side. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can detect a winner in this case. Which one's better, which one looks better, which image is nicer, which is sharper, all of that sort of stuff. I think they both perform really, really well. Of course, the field of view on the crop sensor is slightly tighter, having the 24mm. It's a little bit wider with the 35mm on the full frame camera, but essentially we're looking at the same video here. Nothing really to write home about, nothing out of the ordinary with either of these two examples. Okay guys, so there we go. We'll wrap up with the full frame camera. We did have the winner in the low light performance with the 35mm, just slightly less noise, slightly less grain, particularly as the ISO built up to that 12,800 range. When we're talking about the depth of field, crop sensor with the 24mm had a greater or a deeper depth of field, but that's kind of converse to the effect we're looking for, and we noticed a much bigger improvement in terms of the background blur and that lovely out of focus fall off that we noticed with the 35mm on the full frame. And then to the field of view, that was a slam dunk. We already knew it. The full frame gives you a slightly greater field of view, but again, they're almost interchangeable. They are almost the same. Not much difference there. For the sake of one step back, I could have got the same frame with the 24mm on the crop sensor. And then jumping to the portrait, well, I actually thought that the 35mm on the full frame gave a slightly more natural, a slightly more pleasing perspective on the shot. I guess I could have achieved the same by pushing the 24mm on the crop sensor back a little bit further from me, but I did want to test them side by side, and so that's what we got. The 35mm on the full frame came out the winner in that test as well. And then we came to the macro test, and there was a clear winner as to who could get closer, and that was the 24mm on the crop sensor camera, but I do believe that's most likely due to the minimum focusing distance of each of these lenses. For the 24mm, the minimum focusing distance is 0.14 of a meter from the sensor, whereas on the 35mm, the closest focusing distance is 0.17 of a meter. And then for the video test, well, there was nothing between them. And so there we have it. That was just something that had interested me, how the 35mm on the full frame camera would stack up next to the 24mm on the crop sensor camera, and I think we found out the answers. I do believe that the 35mm on the full frame option is going to give you the better results across the board, but there is a place and there are great uses for the 24mm on the crop sensor camera. If you got any comments or you noticed anything I didn't notice, or there was something I should have tested that I didn't, by all means, let me know down below. Otherwise, have a great day, and we're going to catch you next time.